are going to continue with the program, and now let me introduce the conveners for the next lectures, the PhDs Maria Carmen Gutierrez and Peter Schad, that are going to introduce the next lectures and will moderate the questions for the next lectures.
Yes. Gracias. Yeah, good morning also from our side, Carmen Gutierrez Castorena and Peter Schad. We have the honor to moderate the sessions of today. And you probably know that we have a hard job because our task is to make sure that you fit the time. Okay? Everybody has 20 minutes. And 20 minutes, that means the last minutes are for discussion. So make sure that you end after 15, 16 minutes or so, more or less. Okay, but maybe I should have started with a general good morning to everybody and recall that we are very happy that we have this meeting, that we have both, that we had the field tour, which was really exciting, and that we have now 3 interesting days of Congress. So thanks to the organizers and to everybody who made it possible. Now let's start with the first presentation. It's by Ben Harms from Australia. Welcome. And your topic is Tennosols, a new soil order for Australia. Of course, because we want to see it as well, we will sit down in the auditory and then come back.
Thank you and good morning. I was expecting to have a coffee before this presentation. I thought there was a break, so it's a little bit of a surprise. But I've got some water. Thank you. Is there a hand controller? No. So in 2020, this was going to be about a proposal to introduce Tennosols into the Australian soil classification, but now that has been done. So this is like a review and looking back at the process and what's happened. And to acknowledge my co-authors, Noel Shocknecht and Bernie Powell. So firstly, the Australian soils. This is the approximate correlation to the approximate correlation, very approximate correlation with the World Reference-Based Soil Groups. So just to highlight 3 things. First of all, our abruptic group of soils, our group of abruptic soils, which are solagnettes, mainly lixosols and acrosols. Not too many allosols, Carl, and luvisols. And there's a picture of abruptic solagnettes. We also have lots of vertisols, 12% of the country, 1 million kilometres squared of vertisols seen in grey, in the grey zones on the map. And lots of Tennosols, deep sandy soils, which are common in the inland areas, but also, of course, in alluvial sediments and so forth. But then when we look at the map of the Australian soils, according to the Australian soil classification, in the first and second editions, we did not have Tennosols. So the soils that you just saw before that were in Tennosols WRB were grouped into 2 soil orders, Tennosols and Rudisols. And they're very large groups. making up 41% of the country as tennosols and rudisols. You can see the pale yellow colours here. So they were our soil groups in the first and second edition. So this is a schematic diagram, the 14 orders. We can see the anthroposols, the organosols, podosols, vertisols coming out early, and then our abruptic group, and then split on pH, acidicity, within the B horizon of the abruptic soils, and calcareous throughout. Sorry, that does include deep sands. It's a mistake. Calcareous soils used to include some deep, shelly, sandy soils. And then coming down to the soils, which are the weak pedologic organisation, the tennosols and the rudisols. So the tennosols are at the bottom, like entosols in the soil classification and regisols in entosols soil taxonomy and regisols in WRB. The tennosols are the last group, which are the leftovers, but also with the tennic, weakly developed, the cambic, often with a cambic horizon. So moving on, so why the drivers for a new soil order, to introduce a new soil order, was a big process to add another order into the system. Part of the reason was that there was complaints with tennosols, that they're too big, they cover too much diversity. They are a leftover group, but there is a lot of variation in the tennosols. So they're hard to visualise and characterise just exactly what a tennosol is. And then there was a subjective split between the tennosols and the rudisols in terms of the degree of pedologic development, especially in sandy soils. Was it a rudisol or a tennosol? So if we can split out so these are some examples of tennosols. So we've got a durasol there, a shallow chernozem there, and a deep sand there, all classifying as tennosols in the Australian system. So tennosols in WRB were cambosols, leptosols, arenosols, regisols, and sometimes even we were getting classifications of lithosols, luvisols, because there was a clay coatings and a argic horizon. And likewise in soil taxonomy, inseptosols, iridosols, entosols, and some alphasols. And there's a few more examples. That's one of our gravelly sesquioxide nodules, and that's another one, a leptosol, that similar to one we saw on the field trip here. So, but meanwhile, amongst a deep sand is something that occurs and is recognised and has been used in soil information documents. And when soils are mapped in areas, they're often referring to sands. So sandy soils are recognised for social classifications, if you like. Informal soil classifications are referring to sandy soils. So there was a disconnect between what we had in the soil classification and what people, the farmers and users of the soil, how they were talking about soils. They were talking about deep sands, but where are the deep sands in the Australian soil classification? Well, they're tennosols, rudisols. So, and meanwhile also, arenosols were already recognised internationally. So this was one of the early, based on the world soil map. So we can see, in fact, that Australia, in fact, has about 18% of the arenosols that were on this original map. So, as I've said, the deep sands were spread over 3 orders: the tennosols, rudisols, and also some calcaresols, because there are calcasols, but they also include some shelly sands. So The soil classification in Australia is open for change because it was designed to be flexible. As the new knowledge became available, it should be facilitate revision. And just to illustrate the new knowledge, since the first edition of the Australian Soil Classification in 1996, there were 14,000 characterised soil profiles, but in 2018 there's now 137,000 characterised profiles. So there's a lot more knowledge. The database is a lot more comprehensive than they were when the system was first set up. So the question is, was the system of classification, is it catering sufficiently well for the diversity of soils that we have? So some of these issues were addressed in the third edition, including the Renosol order, but there were numerous other changes, additions and subtractions to the other orders. And just to point out that unlike the previous editions, the third edition of the Australian Soil Classification is available online as a download ebook or a PDF document that you can download for free. So that it's just easy to search on Google. So now we have 15 soil orders. We've put in a Renosols here, just before Rutasols and Tennosols. So they are sands 1 metre deep, and the deep sands that were previously in calcaresols and now have dropped down to arenosols. So fitting the arenosols into the ASC, we had to tweak, adjust slightly the general principles because we didn't have a depth criterion in any of the other orders except for organosols. There is obviously a soil organic material criteria in the top 1 metre of the soil for organosols, but the other orders, there was no depth criteria. So now we've inserted the 1 metre depth criterion for the arenosol order. So that was a conceptual change that was a little bit difficult for some of the traditional pedologists. So these are the diagnostics for our order, the sandy field texture. We've got relatively small amounts of coarse fragments tolerated, so only 10% compared to WIB 40%, and the soil taxonomy SAMENS allow up to 35% of the rock fragments, no hard layers. And we can have finer textures as long as it's not occupying more than 20% of the upper 1 metre of the soil profile. And that was the change that was necessary for calcaresols. And then it took out the issue of working out with those shelly sands, was there any secondary carbonate present, or was it simply just primary shell material? So now we don't have to decide that. Any profile composed of deep shelly sand is a calcaresol. So the issue of how we classify is based on what we see, and it largely depends on how deep we can see into the soil profile. So here's a very deep profile that goes about 10 to 12 metres deep. So we've got a soil here with A horizon, E horizon, and we've got the spotic horizon here. We call it a BHS, and then we've got buried layers here. So the spotic horizon comes in at 4 metres. So if we just auger sample soil down to 3 metres, we will classify that as a arenosol. If we go to 4 metres, we'll classify it in the Australian Soil Classification as a podosol. But if it's a WRB classification, even if we auger to 4 metres, it will still be an arenosol. Bathyspodic, recognising that the spotic horizon is below below 2 metres. So that's still an issue. So there's just two case studies here. This is a soil that is one of our texture contrast soils. We've got a sodic B horizon, just about 1 metre slightly more than 1 metre deep. So that's a natric horizon, ESP20, but it's coming in at 1.02 metres. And that's just pure sand, and there's really no development of any horizon features. There's no BW horizon within that sandy layer. So that's just our A and E horizon. So in the Australian soil classification, we still call that a sodasol. It meets the arenosol criteria, but we classify as a sodasol because the sodasol comes out first, and there is no depth limit on the occurrence of the sodic layer. Now, but another issue is that the classification mismatch is caused by the different types particle size criteria used for are different in Australia compared to WRB or to Europe and USA. So our silts are 2 to 20 micron size, but the silt in the USDA is 2 to 50. So really, to correlate our soils with WRB and soil taxonomy, we need to convert our textures into the USDA. They're done here into the USDA textures classes, and we do have a pedo transfer function to do that to the USDA. So we're converting our sand and silt fractions into the USDA sand and silt fractions. And then when we plug these values into the texture triangle, we find that sort of the top layer in green, that textures as a loamy sand, and then the next layer is also just on the edge of the loamy sand, but the bottom layer of that profile is classified, it comes out as a sandy loam on the USDA texture triangle. But according to our data and our field textures, it's clearly an arenosol because it was a coarse sand only throughout, and the clay content was less than 10% throughout. But still, there's a classification mismatch. So now we have the new soil map of Australia, soils according to ASC 3rd edition, and we have stated the arenosols. So we're looking at the same map now with the new orders. We've got 21% of the country approximately mapped as arenosols, and then we've got much less area of tennosols, rudisols, and a little bit less area of calcaresols. So that's it. And so just in summary, generally been favourably received, but it's still, the message that we have a new order is still to get out to everybody. We're still having products produced, a recent map produced by CSIRO, which didn't include arenosols because they just didn't bother to update the data. It's a better representation of Australian soils. It's a much better correlation with WRB and soil taxonomy, but there's still some classification mismatches, some disharmony in our diagnostic data. So, gracias, thank you. And any questions?
Thank you, Ben, for this interesting and colorful presentation. And thanks for keeping the time. Now we have 3 minutes left for questions and comments. Who wants to ask something, comment on something? Really, nobody? Yes, Erica, please.
I don't know. I think it would be just so intense.
Other questions, comments? No? Okay. So thanks again, Ben.
All right.
And our next speaker is you. Our next speaker is Cezary Krawawa from Poland, and his topic is classification of soils in cold and arid climate of the East Pamir Mountains, northeast Tajikistan. So let's do an excursion to Tajikistan.